Hello, this is Kyrasis. In this Blood Death Knight video, I will be doing a dungeon commentary over a plus 25 Fortified Brackenhide Hollow key I did a little over a week ago since this was requested by someone in my Discord. For some quick upfront information, I am running a mostly standard Mythic Plus talent build except with Grip of the Dead instead of Anti-Magic Zone. I don't feel like Anti-Magic Zone gets a whole lot of value in this dungeon on Fortified, while Grip of the Dead is very useful given all of the fixates and fleeing mobs at the beginning. Furthermore, if you want to see the intended route I was trying to take in this dungeon, a link is provided in the video description. After the nerf to Lasher Trash Count in the second part of the dungeon, you will now generally see two types of routes in this dungeon. One, routes that pick up a large amount of count before the first boss, and two, routes that continue to get a large amount of count between the first and second boss, even after the Lasher Count nerf. The route that I am running is the first type that does a bit of extra pulls at the start of the dungeon. For the first pull, I am dropping a Death and Decay on the pack to the left to get initial aggro on everything, before running past and tagging the Patrol and the 4-pack with the Mystic on the right, all without pulling the Hunter in the front right of the dungeon. Everyone has cooldowns on this pull, and the only source of random damage is one Mystic, so it is not particularly scary even though there are 12 enemies here. However, Sanguine is going to be a source of time loss throughout this entire dungeon, and even in this pull you see me constantly moving near the end to avoid healing. Now, when you're making routes in the first part of this dungeon, the main thing you want to keep in mind is that hunters are extremely dangerous to your group with no way to stop the damage they are doing, and if you have too many mystics, you'll lose the ability to kick all of their casts and they will also become dangerous. For the most part, you can pull just about as many bone crushers and claw fighters as you want without any repercussions. Yes, they do require some amount of AoE stops, but there's nothing that's really hard limiting you from the number of them you can pull. War Scourges and Decay Speakers are very count efficient in particular, but they each require some amount of kicks and they also come with other mobs that you may or may not want. Furthermore, if you have a priest in your group, you don't need to make a route that clears to every cage, and instead you only really need to clear to 2 or 3 depending on what you desire. Much like the first pull, I am attempting to avoid the Hunter Patrol near the second, which involves pulling everything towards the shoreline. Because I accidentally cast a second Death and Decay instead of a Tombstone, I unfortunately put my Purgatory on cooldown very early on into this pull. However, if you want to move this pull anywhere, you're going to want to kick the Decay Speaker's first cast on pull. Everything else, including the Mystic, will run towards you as soon as you engage in combat with them. Beyond staying alive and keeping these pulls as grouped as possible in the first section, my main priority is to shut down my focus target Mystic in every single one of these pulls, whether through kicks, death grips, or blind. All other jobs are being handled by my teammates, and I'm just trusting that they'll be able to handle the fixates mostly on their own, without my help. Everyone should know their kick assignments going into these pulls, and if everything gets executed correctly and everyone does their job, no harmful cast should be going off during these pulls, except for maybe a bolt from the Mystic here or there. It is worth noting that most of the casts from the Decay Speaker only target the tank and do not need to be kicked. They only have one random target ability called Withering Burst, and any single kick with a cooldown of 20 seconds or less should be able to handle it with ease. While I make my way across this first trash area, almost all of these pulls are 2 lieutenant mobs with 1 mystic and a handful of miscellaneous melee enemies. This route does not pull any hunters at all, since they are not very count efficient and they are somewhat dangerous. And outside of having no hunters, the kick requirements left in the pulls are pretty tame outside of 1 double mystic pack that I'm doing at the end of this section. In the first trash section in particular, the graveyard is nearby, so the most important thing is making sure that you personally are not dying on these pulls. The run back is pretty short, so anyone else dying is usually going to be recoverable for your group. However, if you die, all of your group members will very quickly start dying in quick succession afterwards, just due to how these pulls are. There are enough ranged enemies that once you're dead, they'll start gunning down everyone else in your group very quickly. Also, while these trash pulls are not the most dangerous pulls in the world, they do have enough burst potential that they can very easily kill you if you are slacking on your defensive cooldown rotation or your death striking. That is going to be a case for a lot of the trash in this dungeon, or even some of the bosses, where the average intake might not be too high, but the packs still do have a respectable amount of burst potential, so just be careful about that. Routing wise, since I have already committed to killing the 4 enemies on the rock slope, as well as the single patrolling war scourge on the road that were near these enemies, I am now able to access these 3 melee enemies in the back, and take these into the Decay Speaker 3-pack in the middle of the road without worrying about the now dead patrol which would originally pad into this. One objective for this 4th pull is also to kill the war scourge in the back to give me better options for the final pull in this section. Also, it is worth noting that I had my priest open up a cage with Mind Soothe near the hunter pack to the south while I was setting up this pull. That being said, there is not too much else to say about the first part of this dungeon trash-wise. Most of these pulls are just rinse and repeat with slightly different trash compositions. Though it is worth noting that the Bone Crushers and War Scourges have a random target melee tank buster ability that can hit the DPS as well as yourself, but there's not a whole lot that you can do personally about this as the tank, so it's more up to your melee DPS to handle these abilities as they see fit. The last pull in this first section of trash is the only double mystic pull that I do. And while I'm not overly enthusiastic about doing a large pull right before the first boss, this is the only real way to set up an efficient pull that is worth your time in the first place, unless you commit to skipping the War Scourge pack outside of the first boss room altogether. Though that seems like a little bit of a waste since the pack includes a War Scourge and 4 melee enemies, which is normally a pretty good composition of enemies that you'd want to kill in this section. I have seen some groups experiment with pulling this 5-pack into the first boss after killing 2 of the 3 bosses in the trio, but I'm on the fence about whether or not that is a good use of time. Now, if you're worried about this pack being overly dangerous and you want to make it safer as fast as possible, given the fact that you need 1 person to kick the Decay Speaker, 1 person to kick the Fear and the War Scourge, and then you only have leftover kicks to deal with the 2 Mystics, I mean, unless you're a Prot Paladin, that usually means you're going to have a couple of bolt casts go through with that setup. You, the Mystics do have the lowest HP in this pack, and you could just focus them down if you want to make things safer faster. Though obviously it's not going to be the fastest way to kill the whole pack in its entirety. But again, just play things by ear depending on the affixes, your group composition, and how dangerous the pack is to you. With the last trash pack dead, we just need to open 2 of these cages, one of which requires a priest for this route in particular, and then we move into the first boss. In general, for the first boss, we'll want to be focusing down one of the more dangerous bosses as fast as possible. In general, this is going to be the caster, since the caster, in combination with the other mechanics going on, is what's going to lead to people dying. Now, it is true that Gnashtooth is technically the most dangerous of the 3 because it's constantly putting bleeds on people and fixating people with its butchery cast, but at the same time, it's a lot harder to focus down Gnashtooth, and Gnashtooth alone generally isn't going to be killing people. So I think you are much better off taking care of the caster, especially in pugs where it's harder to get every single kick that the caster is doing. Now, normally there is a berserk ability that the caster uses when one of the 3 bosses is below 15% health. There's currently a bug right now with this ability where if the totem that the bosses summon is below 15% health but not completely dead when the caster chooses to use a new ability, it treats the totem as if one of the bosses was below 15% and will enrage all of the bosses as a result. Even if all of the bosses are at close to full health for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. Now, some people think this is less likely to happen if you don't kick the caster during the intermission, and that might be true, that that also leads to a situation where people are more likely to die since the healer is CC'd while people are taking damage. So it's just something to keep in mind in any case, even though there's not a whole lot you can do about it. As the tank on this fight, our job is very simple. We just don't want to cleave anyone with Hack Claw, and for the most part, just coordinate a kick rotation with your group if you're in voice, since you probably have the least stressful job for most of this fight. Now, as a blood DK, it's important to note that while your AMS is up, you will not get incapacitated by the magic debuff, allowing you to attack for the duration of AMS, though it won't immune the application. At a minimum, this lets you DPS the totem as the tank for at least a little while before you become crowd controlled yourself. If you also happen to be a dwarf, you can use your dwarf racial while AMS is up and you have control of your character to then get the debuff off of you yourself without any help from your healer. Though dwarf racial is not a low enough cooldown for you to be able to do this every single time it happens. So while it might be tempting to use AMS and a bolt going through on you just to get some absorb value out of it and some runic power, I'd really hold on to it for the intermission because that's really going to be the only thing that's going to wipe you under most circumstances. Also, when it comes to intercepting the charge from Hackclaw, just make sure you're using a respectable amount of defensives for that ability. It does quite a lot of damage and it can one-shot you if you are not respecting it properly. In the second section of Trash, we are generally trying to minimize the amount of Rotsingers and Oaks we are pulling in this section, while still trying to keep the pulls as reasonably sized as possible. As long as you don't go too crazy with the pull sizes here, almost any amount of Treants and Shapers is going to be fine. For this first pull, the only major mob I am pulling is a single Rotsinger along with a mix of smaller mobs. For all intents and purposes, the first cast of the Decay Totem is probably going to go off no matter what you do once you're past a certain key level. It's just not realistic to kill the totems fast enough to stop that first cast from happening, but as long as they don't get affected by Sanguine Healing, Passive Cleave is usually enough to kill the totems before their second casts. So you just want to make sure that you are tanking enemies close enough to the totem so that they are taking this Passive Cleave damage. As Blood Death Knight, we can pre-AMS disease applications from these totems, in addition to the extra action button that we get from the alchemy bonus. If you are a dwarf, that also gives you another removal option, and since I have both AMS and the dwarf racial, I will usually use both of those before I use the one-time use alchemy items, since, especially as the tank, we don't have the opportunity to restock that constantly on a lot of these pulls. While there are only a few in the second trash section, monstrous decays are a very efficient trash count and are not particularly dangerous, so you should pull as many of these as you realistically can. You just need to make sure that you get aggro once they split into 3 smaller slimes, since the smaller slimes do significant enough melee damage that they can easily kill people, which does happen once during this run when I'm neglecting one of these slime splits. Even if you kill the large slimes fast enough, once they start their channel to split into smaller slimes, they will still split into the smaller slimes, even if you do happen to kill them before they get this cast off. So just keep that in mind. I am a little overambitious to run up this hill while the patrolling oak is not in the way, but this ultimately gets my priest killed when I assume that the small slimes are mostly harmless. Going into this next pull, it is beneficial if everyone can restock their disease removal item from the nearby cauldron. But if everyone stays by the cauldron for an extended period of time during this next pull, they will risk pulling the oak patrol once it comes back up the hill. So I purposely move away from it so my ranged DPS are forced to move into the room a little bit for the next pull. Now, if you're going to pull any oak at all in this section of the dungeon, the one at the top of this hill is the best one to pull because it comes along with 11 smaller mobs that each give count and die pretty early on into this pull. Granted, there's not too much else to pull in this area unless you pull it with a nearby Rotsinger patrol, so that is what I am doing right here. I just don't have a better alternative for this at this time, even though this pull is a little bit dangerous, and even though the oak has the highest health, there's a lot of pressure on the group to focus the Rotsinger instead just to stop the totems from spawning. But it is what it is. Things get very overcomplicated with routing if you try to avoid either this Rotsinger or the oak or both, so I haven't really figured out a route which makes that ever worth it. Though one might exist if someone thinks up something clever. As you can see, The oaks have a bad habit of standing in sanguine puddles for long periods of time, so even though everything else is pretty much dead in this pool, the oak is back to full health, which leads to a few other interesting events. You see, our next planned pull is actually the tree boss itself, so we ideally want this oak dead before we do anything else. However, we decide on the spur of the moment to try to take the oak with us through the skip we are using to pass the double oak patrol. The oak just barely makes it through the window in time to avoid pulling the patrol, but a Shadow Priest pet ultimately pulls the oak patrol and causes a large time loss. In retrospect, trying to bring the oak through the window was probably not the best idea, but it is what it is, and we try to clean everything up so we can get back on track. Oaks give a pretty good amount of trash count on their own, with only a small kick requirement. However, the constant stream of lashers they spawn hurt any split AoE damage or target capped damage the group might have, though there are a few specializations like enhancement shamans that can benefit from having all of these extra low health enemies around, even if they aren't worth any trash count anymore. Furthermore, the lashers put a stacking random target bleed on group members that can be potentially lethal when it gets out of hand. All in all, the oaks are pretty slow to clear and somewhat dangerous, so you shouldn't be going out of your way to pull them if you can help it. Though some routes for this dungeon require that you kill a decent amount of them in order to unlock other count options available in this part of the dungeon. And as you'll see as we are cleaning up these oaks, if you do miss one of the kicks on these things, they can very easily kill one or more of your party members instantly. So compared to everything else in this section, it's very important that you are kicking these things in the pull that they are in versus just about any other cast in this section. Now, while we are cleaning up these oaks, I just want to give some explanation on the next boss. The tree boss, if you do everything correctly on him, does not really do much damage to anyone, not to you, not to anyone in the group. So he's a very good candidate for bringing trash onto him at the start of the pull. The only downside with this week in particular is that since it is sanguine and since the boss plants a lot in place, the sanguine is very likely just going to heal him to full if we try to fight trash on this boss for this week, so that is the main reason why we are not going to do that here. Though otherwise, a pull that we do after this boss is something we would normally fight on top of this boss, and it saves a lot of time. Actually, I believe now that I have the extra count from these two oaks, which were not originally on the route, I think I remove the trash altogether that I would normally pull into Treemouth, which includes the 4 shapers and 2 large slimes to the southeast that are normally off to the side. As for Treemouth himself, we are just making sure not to hit anyone with a frontal cone ability. DPS and healers should be dropping ad spawns close to the boss so you can pick them up without aiming the frontal towards the rest of your group, and a single AoE stop should be used for each set of oozes just to stop all of their casts before they kill the entire group. As a Death Knight, we are also able to anti-magic shell to immune the dot application for when Treemouth eats you. So regardless for how many stacks of the vulnerability debuff we get, we will never take any damage from this mechanic as long as we don't screw up our anti-magic shell usage. That being said, anti-magic shell doesn't stop the boss from getting an absorb shield, so it is still faster to use rogues and paladins when they have the appropriate abilities for them to get spit out quickly from the boss without a shield being generated. As long as all of the mechanics are being handled appropriately in this fight, Treemouth is not challenging at all and will fall over fairly quickly. The only other thing that comes to mind is that you can get hit with the slime on death explosions when you are inside the boss. And if you get hit with multiple explosions at once, they do have the ability to kill you or to cheat you. So you might not want to get too careless around that mechanic, and that might be something to potentially use defensives on if you are forced to get hit with one or a few of those at the same time. Also, the large absorb shield that this boss gets when it consumes a player goes away once that player gets spit out, and a lot of times you just won't be able to break through it in time. So any damage that you're putting into the boss when he has eaten you or another player is pretty much completely wasted until that player is spit out. So if you have Beacon to Beyond or some other short-term burst damage, you might want to consider holding it during that period of time. Furthermore, after interrupting the initial casts on each of these slimes, you're really not in any rush to kill any of them at all. So just keep all of your damage focused on the boss if at all possible and use them for funneling purposes. Now, if this was a week where I'd be pulling trash onto the boss, it's worth noting that you can get eaten by the boss and all of the trash will still just stay aggroed on you and attacking you. Since you're not actually taking any damage when the boss eats you, you could still tank everything just fine and it's not particularly dangerous at all. So if you're thinking about pulling trash on the boss and you're worried about that, there's nothing really to worry about. With Treemouth defeated, any optimized route is going to involve skipping Stink Breath through one method or another, which usually involves Mind Soothe in combination with some weird movement or jumps. If you don't have a priest, you can have a rogue, hunter, or night elf pull him back and loop around while the rest of your group goes through, or you could also do a death skip. Even if you wanted to fight him, he is kind of dangerous on his own, and all nearby trash mobs are also very dangerous if you are looking for things to combine with him. So there's really no winning in this situation if you don't skip him. If you have the time to fight him solo and you don't want to go through the hassle, feel free. But otherwise, I'd skip him if it isn't too much trouble for you to coordinate something like that. In general, you will be pulling a bear and potentially two vultures into the third boss. As long as the vultures, as well as the boss, are all being kicked, there's nothing too harmful about having the trash included, and it dies pretty quickly once the first set of traps come out. In this case, our demon hunter respec'd into something more suitable for the last boss, and they had trouble getting back to the dungeon, so we don't want to pull the third boss immediately. Granted, if we trusted that he wasn't going to die on the walk over, I don't think anything was technically stopping us from starting the boss earlier with 4 people, and the demon hunter should have still been able to make it into the room since no barriers come up during this fight. While Gutshot is a pretty straightforward boss, sometimes the boss can do a surprising amount of burst damage with the Gutshot ability, especially on Tyrannical. So you don't want to be completely disrespecting the boss, and you do want to use defensives for that, since there's not a whole lot else to be using the defensives on anyway in this fight. And while you generally should not be getting hit by this mechanic, the Tank Buster from the Hyenas also does a very high amount of damage and gives you a nasty debuff whenever it connects. When a fresh set of hyenas run into the room, you ideally want to keep them stacked. Either have you or the healer pull them into a trap with aggro before they fixate on a player, and then bring the boss near them for some passive cleave. The traps do a lot of damage to the hyenas on their own, but passive cleave can still help to kill them significantly faster and save a trap charge or two, which can help with future sets of hyenas. In general, I'd only worry about picking up initial threat on the hyenas quickly if it looks like someone might die otherwise, since we can't generate threat on both of them at the same time without being close enough to hit them both with a blood boil, or without using Death and Decay, though we do have Grip of the Dead selected, or at least I do for this dungeon, and I don't really want to be snaring them, because that will just give them time to then leap to different players and spread out. You do want to quickly take them to the traps while they are both stacked, so you can hit them both with a single trigger of each trap. Other than that, Gutshot usually isn't too dangerous of a boss, but it is possible for people to die if you're playing it sloppy, so just pay attention to what's going on. As for the trap spawns, the traps can spawn on you as well as other players. And a lot of times I do see players putting these traps right next to each other, but I do think you'll have a lot better success into getting the hyenas into the traps faster if you leave enough spacing for people to move around each individual trap. It just gives your group a lot more mobility options. After Gutshot is dead, a lot of the trash pulls near the end of the dungeon are pretty efficient to do, as long as you know your limits, so many of the routes nowadays will pull most if not all of the trash in that section. Right off the bat, we have a pull with a filth caller and several wither biters. If available, we do want to pull in the patrolling war scourge as well, and we can also pull in one or two rot hexers from the center, depending on whether or not we have one or two disease dispels available with our group composition. Filth callers nuke the tank for a respectable amount of damage, and channel an ability with avoidable AoEs and area denial. They are a good target for leftover kicks and stops, since there's not much else to use kicks or stops on in this section, but nothing they do is overly dangerous and it's not the end of the world if they get several casts off. Meanwhile, the Rot Hexers constantly apply diseases to players that deal a lot of damage if they don't get removed in a timely manner. However, as long as you can remove all the diseases they are applying to players, they are pretty tame and worth a lot of trash count for the health that they have. Just make sure that you're not pulling more than what your disease dispels can handle. That being said, the second pull in this section has an alchemy cauldron available, which can be used to spam disease dispel and effectively lets you pull as many rot hexers as you want as long as you are fighting in the immediate area of the cauldron. The cauldron ability just has a 12-second cooldown, but it is independent per player that is using it. The disease that the rot hexers apply to players can also spread to nearby allies while it is active on said player. So you do not want to be stacked with other people, and stopping the area denial from the filth callers will make it easier for the rest of your group to manage the debuffs without accidentally spreading it to each other. Beyond that, this last section of trash does not involve a lot of incoming damage on the tank, unless you are getting hit with synced filth caller casts, which is something you do want to be looking out for. There are additional enemies called diseased slashers in the final pull, but those are also not particularly dangerous to you or the rest of your group, so you have a pretty easy path to the final boss regardless. Now, if you wanted to, you could fight 3 or even 4 Vile Rot Hexers on top of this cauldron, just due to how much disease dispel capability your group will have while being next to that thing. However, I do think if you are doing the pull up front, right after the third boss with all the withered biters, you're just better off mixing in 1 or 2 rot hexers into that pull anyway, because you'll already be killing all of that stuff as well as a war scourge, so you may as well make that pull a decent size on its own as well. Now for the last trash pull, everything in the front portion of this room is fair game. You could pull all of it at once. It's a good amount of count, and it wouldn't be particularly dangerous. Now for this particular route, we are not pulling the War Scourge on the right side, and this is mostly just due to the fact that we don't need the count for it. But again, you could add it in and it would be fine. Now at the start of this pull, these smaller gnolls, they are very inconsistent. Sometimes they'll start attacking you right away, and sometimes they'll just freeze in place for a couple of seconds. I think it has something to do with RP and whether or not someone has inched themselves up towards the door in the previous pull or not. So if they're not, it's almost inconvenient that they don't move right away. But in any case, just like the pull before, the main danger as the tank in this pull are the filth callers getting off the synced casts. So just keep an eye on those and make sure that you're not getting hit with 2 casts at the same time, or if you are, just make sure that you have a suitable amount of defensive cooldowns ready to take care of that. Now, depending on how your timer looks, you may want to consider holding some cooldowns for next pull. As a blood DK, this could maybe include Dancing Rune Weapon, but one thing I'm really talking about here is Beacon to the Beyond, which is a trinket that's very much going to help you out. Beyond that, none of our cooldowns as a Blood Death Knight really matter all that much as far as saving them is concerned for making the last boss fight easier. If you're ever thinking about pulling a War Scourge onto this final boss, I would highly recommend against it. Anything else might be fine, but the War Scourges have an aura that reduce enemy cooldowns, and it can very easily cause some very strange spell queuing to happen during the boss that you would rather not need to deal with. In any case, positioning on this boss is very flexible, but there are a few things you want to keep in mind. First, the gas cloud always moves clockwise around the room, so it's better to make sure that the boss is already facing in the clockwise direction, if at all possible, so the cloud is exiting the same direction that it spawns. When the boss spawns totems during this encounter, they will always be created in preset positions on the opposite side of the room from where the boss is currently situated. You can have the boss closer to the center of the room to decrease your run distance, but how the room is cut up based on where the totems spawn on the opposite sides is very arbitrary and not particularly well defined on the floor, so unless you are very familiar with how the totem spawns work, it might just be more consistent to have the boss on the outside of the room as much as possible. Given the gas cloud, your goal is to have the totems spawn in the position where they will always be attackable by melee from the very moment that they are created. So, in the very back of the rotating glass cloud, or a little ways behind it, is generally the target location. This usually means that you're going to need to move the boss counterclockwise a bit after the initial gas cloud is created, so you can adjust for a better totem spawn location. And this is something I forget to do for the very first totem spawn in this fight, though we have enough damage for the first totem that it isn't really much of an issue. Given a good first totem spawn location, you generally won't need to move the boss after you kill that before the second one is spawned. The version of this boss we are fighting in this video is before a nerf that slowed the cast time of the totems, making them easier to kill before they get their first cast off. This mechanic has gotten nerfed several times already, and it might even get nerfed more in the future, since there's a pretty big deal on whether or not you're able to kill these totems before they get their first cast off, or if you kill them after. Outside of saving Beacon to the Beyond and other cooldown trinkets for these totems, you have the option to pre-pop Death and Decay or Abomination Limb at their location before they're attackable if you wanted to get a little bit more extra damage on them, and you want to target swap to them immediately. Since the fight is not particularly dangerous to Blood Death Knights, you could even consider emptying your entire runic power pool into slamming a high amount of death strikes into the totems in particular. The only tank mechanic this boss does is a heal absorb, but given how Blood Death Knights work, this is never really much of a threat for us, and we can even line up our Vampiric Bloodcast to quickly take care of the debuff. At a high enough key level, the burst damage from both the Totem Explosion and the boss AoE at the same time can be potentially lethal to the rest of our group, but these overlaps are still survivable with good defensive usage. If you were going to take Anti-Magic Zone for this dungeon, it would be almost entirely to help with the AoE overlaps on this boss if you are not able to avoid all of them. In any case, the boss has a very predictable pattern of abilities that cycle every 2 totem spawns. As you can see, despite the fact that we lost a lot of time from Sanguine Healing and pulling the 2 extra oaks that were patrolling before Treemouth, you can see that we still have plenty of time left on our dungeon timer, even in a 25. So, Brackenhide really emphasizes clean execution over anything else. You just need a solid route that your group can reliably do with minimal deaths, and that is the end of my dungeon commentary for Brackenhide. As always, feel free to stop by the channel Discord if you have any feedback, suggestions, or if you would like a Mythic Plus log review. The Discord information, as well as my Discord contact information, is in the video description below. Let me know what you think in the video comments below, and if you would like to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.